This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order all the cards in this video by using the link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and I'm continuing with my limited set review for the Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth. So far I've looked at all the multicolored, colorless, white, blue, and black cards, and today we're continuing with red. For each of these cards I'll discuss how I think they'll play in limited, and I'll sum up my thoughts by using a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews, you can find out what my grades mean by looking in the description. A couple of things to keep in mind as we look at the cards. I'm only evaluating these for limited play and not for other formats. These are my evaluations of these cards before playing with them, so I of course won't be right about everything, but I will be providing updates about them in the future. Additionally, only cards that appear in draft boosters will be reviewed in this video. Lastly, I want to let you know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and by the end of the set review, you'll have a spreadsheet with all of my grades. If those perks sound interesting to you and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, without further ado, let's look at the first red card in Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth, which is Battle-Scarred Goblin, which for 1 generic into red is a 2/2 Goblin Warrior at common, and when it becomes blocked, it deals 1 damage to each creature blocking it. This isn't the most exciting upside ever, but it does mean it can trade with X3s, and it basically can't be blocked at all by X1s. It can also be kind of funny if you pair it with Death Touch. It also has a useful creature type, so it seems like a fine 2-drop. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Book of Mazar, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment saga. Its chapter 1 says Amass Orcs 1. This means you put a +1/+1 counter on an army you control. It's also an orc. If you don't control an army, create a 0/0 black orc army creature token first. Chapter 2 says Amass Orcs 2. And chapter 3 says creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain menace until end of turn. This looks like a really good saga to me because it impacts the board up front. Sure, paying 3 and getting that chapter 1 isn't going to feel amazing at first. You just got a 3 mana 1/1 or paid 3 mana to put a counter on an army you already had. But the book ends up delivering some really nice value over the next 2 turns. You end up getting way more than 3 mana's worth of value out of this, even if you do have to wait for it. All on its own, you end up with a 3 mana 3/3 and also a mass pump effect that can do a pretty good job of closing out games if you're getting this later on. Overall, I think this looks like a good uncommon. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Breaking of the Fellowship, which for 1 generic and a red is a common sorcery. Target creature an opponent controls deals damage equal to its power to another target creature that player controls. The ring tempts you. We've seen cards like this before, and they're always pretty difficult to set up correctly. First, your opponent needs to have 2 creatures. Second, one has to be able to kill the other. That sounds simple enough, but the stat lines don't always line up that way. The fact this is a sorcery makes it even harder to make it work. Basically, this is a removal spell that asks too much to be very good, especially because you don't have that much control over what it's asking for. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Cast into the Fire, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. It says choose one. Cast into the Fire deals 1 damage to each of up to 2 target creatures. Exile target artifact. This has 2 modes that aren't useful often enough, and while the fact that you can choose between them helps offset how narrow each of them is, we're still looking at a card that won't do anything meaningful often enough. This means it's sideboard material. It's a D in your main deck and a C out of your sideboard. Next up, it's Display of Power, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a rare instant. This spell can't be copied. Copy any number of target instant and or sorcery spells. You may choose new targets for the copies. The concept here is pretty cool, but I don't think it works out that well in Limited. There just aren't multiple instants and sorceries on the stack in Limited that often, so most of the time this will just be a 3 mana fork. That's not a terrible card. My only point is that you shouldn't expect being able to copy more than 1 spell with this, and even that is fairly situational. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Aomer, Marshal of Rohan, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4/4 legendary human knight at rare. He's got haste, and whenever 1 or more other attacking legendary creatures you control die, untap all creatures you control. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. This ability triggers only once each turn. A 4 mana 4/4 with haste is a nice starting point, and if you put your opponent in a bind where they have to kill one of your attacking legendary creatures, they will be in a lot of trouble. You can even pull off some shenanigans like sacrificing an attacking legendary creature to get the extra combat step. All of that said, most of the time this is probably just going to play like a 4 mana 4/4 with haste, but I'm reasonably happy with that, and this will sometimes spike this crazy additional upside. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Aomer of the Ritter mark, which for 4 generic and a red is a 5/4 legendary human knight at uncommon. He's got haste, and whenever it attacks, if you control a creature with the greatest power among creatures on the battlefield, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. A 5 mana 5/4 haste is fine, so the fact that this can spit out a 1/1 a decent chunk of the time is pretty nice. Since Aomer himself has 5 power, there's a pretty good chance he'll be making the first token the turn you play him and attack with him, and that's going to feel pretty good. I think this is another B. Next up, it's Erebor Flamesmith, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 Dwarf Artificer at common. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, Erebor Flamesmith deals 1 damage to each opponent. We see a spell payoff like this in basically every format that has a spell deck, and they're always pretty reasonable, especially when you can get multiples of them that are pinging your opponent every time you cast an instant or sorcery, something your deck already wants to be doing. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Erkenbrand, Lord of Westfold, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/3 legendary human soldier at uncommon. When Erkenbrand or another human enters the battlefield under your control, creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. So we've seen a lot of 4 mana 3/3s that give +1/+1 to your whole board, and they're usually pretty medium. This doesn't offer the toughness boost, but it does have the potential to offer multiple boosts if you have enough humans in your deck, and it goes especially well with human creature tokens, since those help you go wide and trigger this, sometimes more than once in a turn. Still, I've been disappointed by enough similar cards over the years that I'm starting this at a C. Next up, it's Fall of Caer Andros, which for 2 generic and a red is a rare enchantment. Whenever a creature an opponent controls is dealt excess non-combat damage, amass Oryx X, where X is that excess damage, and you can pay 7 generic and a red for it to do 7 damage to target creature. You don't do excess damage with non-combat damage often enough for this to really be something that will work out regularly. The thing that really fascinates me about it is that if a ramp deck is legit in this format, and I think it might be in red-green, this gets kind of interesting because it can fuel itself. Once you have 8 mana, you can use this every turn to kill something, almost assuredly, and generate a body or make your army even bigger. So in the extreme late game, this is going to be pretty powerful. The questions I have about the card are for the entire rest of the game when, unless you have a bunch of spells that do damage, which you'll have some of, but I don't think you'll have enough to consistently trigger this, so it's just not going to be doing anything until you reach that 8 mana threshold, and I think that probably means it's just a D+. Next up, it's Fear Fire Foes, which for X and a red is an uncommon sorcery. Damage can't be prevented this turn. It deals X damage to target creature, and 1 damage to each other creature with the same controller. Red X spells are basically never an efficient form of removal, and this particular one can't even hit players, which is a little sad. But still, it's a removal spell that can scale as the game goes on, just as your opponent's creatures are getting larger, so it works out okay. Also, the fact that this might pick off an X1 or 2 on top of the other creature you kill is pretty awesome, and depending on how many of those are around, this might actually feel efficient when you do kill some of those, but most of the time I'm imagining this just killing one thing and you sort of overpaying to do it, even though it's flexible. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Fiery Inscription, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. So this is a build around. You need a lot of instants and sorceries, because 3 mana to get tempted by the ring isn't good enough. If you do end up in a spell deck, which is very possible in red, and I'm talking about like 7 or more instants and sorceries, it can become a pretty real win condition. However, I don't think the ceiling on it is insanely high since it can only hit players. It can definitely pressure your opponent to an extent, but even in a deck that's ideal for it, I think the ceiling is probably a C+, and it's probably a D in your typical red deck in the format. Next up, it's Fire of Orthonk, which for 3 generic and a red is a common sorcery. Destroy target artifact or land. Creatures without flying can't block this turn. Destroying lands is almost never worth it in limited, especially at 4 mana. And sure, this can also destroy artifacts, but there aren't so many of those that you really need to run a card like this. And it also adds in the creatures without flying can't be blocked effect. All of that is nice, I guess. It makes it better than if this just destroyed a land for 4 mana, in which case it would be an F. All the other stuff it can do makes it a D-, I guess, but it's still something that will virtually never make the cut. Next up, it's Foray of Oryx, which for 3 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery. Amass Oryx 2. When you do, Foray of Oryx deals X damage to target creature an opponent controls, where X is the amassed army's power. So at worst, this is a 4 mana 2/2 that does 2 to something. That's a card you would play, and this has the upside of sometimes doing significantly more damage, provided this isn't the first time you've amassed. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Gimli, Counter of Kills, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/3 legendary dwarf warrior at uncommon. He's got Trample, and whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, Gimli deals 1 damage to that creature's controller. I'm about as impressed with Gimli, Counter of Kills as I was with Legolas, Counter of Kills earlier in the week. I mean, a 4-mana 4/3 Trampler just isn't enough these days. That would be a C- at the very best. And while his ability will allow you to get in some extra damage, the only time it will feel significant is when you find yourself in a spot where you can attack with everything, at which point he can wreak havoc on combat because your opponent really has to pay attention to what happens when they block and what damage they'll take as a result of their creatures dying and all of that. Meanwhile, he does die to a ton of cheap removal, and the ceiling you're hoping for doesn't line up that often. I think he's just a C. Next up, it's Gimlis Ax, which for 2 generic and a red is a common artifact equipment. The equipped creature gets +3/+0. As long as equipped creature is legendary, it has Menace, and it equips for 2 mana. +3/+0 and Menace is enough to make anything into a threat, but even in a set with this many legendaries, and with Tempted by the Ring, which will make your creature legendary, you aren't always going to be able to count on that. And when this doesn't grant Menace, it just doesn't seem that good. It's kind of expensive to move around for something that doesn't buff toughness at all. It can make just about any creature, like your 2/2 becomes a 5/2, so your opponent definitely has to account for it in combat. But if they already had a 2-mana 2/2 of their own that can trade with it, well, it can still trade with it. So overall, I'm not that impressed. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Gimlis Fury, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. Target creature gets +3/+2 until end of turn. If it's legendary, it also gains Trample until end of turn. I feel bad for Gimli because this is another Gimli card that I'm not that excited about. +3/+2 just isn't that good of a boost for 2 mana. It's not terrible. It's a trick you'll play, but you do need to be getting Trample with this consistently for it to feel more like it's worth it. And this has the same problem as Gimlis Ax. Sure, sometimes you'll have a legendary you can use this on, and that's going to be great. In fact, you'll probably have one a decent chunk of the time. But you won't always, and when you don't, this just feels really underwhelming. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Glowin, Dwarf Emissary, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/3 legendary dwarf advisor at rare. Whenever you cast a historic spell, create a treasure token. This ability triggers only once each turn, and you can tap him and sacrifice a treasure to goad a creature. This has solid base stats, and getting a treasure or 2 out of him is very doable. Goading creatures is nice too, as it's surprisingly flexible. You can use it to force a small creature to attack into your larger creature who can just block it easily, or you can use it more to get a good blocker out of the way on your next turn by forcing it to attack. That all means Glowin has a real impact on the board all game long, giving him a B. Next up, it's Goblin Fire Leaper, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/1 Goblin Warrior at uncommon. It can pump its power for 1 generic and a red, and when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to target creature an opponent controls. A 2-mana 1/1 that does 1 to something when it dies is borderline playable, and this has a much higher ceiling than that. It goes great with equipment and other buffs, and it can buff its own power, of course, really representing a problem for your opponent. It's a pretty nice card all game long, as you can always attack with it and threaten to buff it, which creates problems on most board states. Your opponent often has to take it or risk getting 2 for 1 when it gets pumped, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Grishnock, Brash Instigator, which is a 1/1 legendary goblin soldier for 2 generic and a red. It's an uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you amass Oryx 2. When you do, until end of turn, gain control of target non-legendary creature an opponent controls with power less than or equal to the amassed army's power. Untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn. Even if you completely disregard the threaten effect here, a 3-mana 1/1 that makes a 2/2, or alternatively puts 2 counters on an army you already have, is a card you would always play. With the threaten effect in the mix, it gets even better, especially if you're in black-red and you have some cheap sacrifice outlets. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Haradrim Spearmaster, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/3 human soldier at common. It's got reach. At the beginning of combat on your turn, another target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. It's a little sad it can't buff itself, as that would have made it significantly better because it would sort of be a 3-mana 3/3 with reach at worst, but offering +1/+0 to something else every turn still does a decent enough job of improving combat often enough for this to be fine, giving it a C. Next up, it's Hugh the ENT Wood, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a mythic rare sorcery. Sacrifice any number of lands. Reveal the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of lands sacrificed this way. Choose any number of artifact and or land cards revealed this way. Put all non-land cards chosen this way onto the battlefield, then put all land cards chosen this way onto the battlefield tapped. Then, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So, red always gets a card at high rarity in every set that's super wacky and potentially powerful if things line up perfectly, but really impractical for limited, and that's what this is. This set doesn't have enough crazy powerful artifacts in it for you to feel good about casting this. Most of the time, casting this will basically not accomplish anything, and obviously that's not really a card you want to be casting. I think this is an F. Next up, it's Improvised Club, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. As an additional cost to cast it, sacrifice an artifact or creature. It deals 4 to any target. Giving up a real creature for this is bad, as you end up 2 for 1ing yourself, but if you have treasure or food or some expendable body to sacrifice, and they are in the format, this will do a decent job. It's nice that it can go after the opponent, so sometimes it can close out games, but it takes enough setup to actually be worthwhile that you're not always going to play it, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Moria Marauder, which for 2 red is a 1/1 Goblin Warrior. At rare, it's got double strike. Whenever a Goblin or Orc you control deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. There are lots and lots of Orcs and Goblins in this set, especially in red and especially in black-red more broadly. This includes your armies, of course, as well as all the other cards with the creature types. So it isn't wild to imagine playing the Marauder on a board where you already have creatures with those types and getting to attack with them that same turn, so you make sure you at least threaten to get some value out of this ability. Furthermore, if you play the Marauder on turn 2 and you're on the play, there will be many situations where your opponent just can't block a 1/1 double striker very well, and that's also a pretty big problem for your opponent. You get to look at 2 cards, obviously, when a double striker gets through unblocked. Basically, I think getting extra cards out of this is pretty doable, and the baseline's fine, giving it a B. Next up, it's Oliphant, which for 5 generic and a red is a 6/4 elephant at common. It's got trample. When it attacks, another target creature you control gets +2/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. And it has mountain cycling for 1 generic. That means you can pay 1 generic, discard it, and search your library for a mountain and put it into your hand. So a 6-mana 6/4 with trample isn't very good. I do like that it buffs something else when it attacks, and giving something else +2/+0 and trampler is usually enough to make another creature into a decent attacker. Although I almost feel like I would prefer it did it when it entered the battlefield so that I could get some immediate value out of the Oliphant, especially because it has such low toughness for how much mana it costs, and there's a good chance it dies before it ever does anything, and usually for a lot less mana. But hey, like all of these land cyclers, in the early game, if you really need a land drop, it can find it for you. And then in the later game, it's a reasonable creature that you're not going to feel terrible about casting, giving it a C. Next up, it's Olaghai Crusher, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/4 troll soldier at common. It's got trample. It can't block unless you control a goblin or orc. Now, this isn't exactly the goblin or orc payoff you're hoping for, but a 4-mana 4/4 trampler is fairly formidable in limited, and it will usually... Maybe usually is a strong word, but it will frequently be able to block. In red-black decks especially, I think it looks fine overall, giving it a C. Next up, it's Quarrels End, which for 2 generic and a red is a common sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, discard a card, draw 2 cards, and create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. So this is an interesting take on the tormenting voice effect we see in every set. It costs 1 more, but you also get to add something to the board, and usually that's not the case. Still, like most tormenting voice effects, this isn't a card that actually makes the cut all the time or anything. It's sort of like your 23rd card a lot of the time. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Rally at the Hornburg, which for 1 generic and a red is a common sorcery. Create 2 1/1 white human soldier creature tokens. Humans you control gain haste until end of turn. 2 mana for 2 1/1s with haste would be a fine card in any format, but there are many cards in the format that like it, first of all, when you put multiple humans into play. There's also several cards in the format that like it when you go wide in general. So I think this has a bunch of extra synergy in the format that makes it even better, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Ranger's Firebrand, which for 1 red mana is an uncommon sorcery. It deals 2 damage to any target and the ring tempts you. This looks great. 1 mana for 2 damage is always an awesome rate, and it means you can easily trade up when you cast this. This would be premium even if it didn't have the ring tempts you, but it does, and that's some powerful additional value to tack onto an already premium removal spell, giving it a B. Next up, it's Relentless Rohirion, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/3 human knight at common. When it enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you. These aren't great stats these days, but because the ring tempts you on ETB, you are at worst going to give this 1 extra ability, although If it's the first time the ring has tempted you, it isn't going to feel very good, as a 4/3 can still be blocked by lots of things. But if it's a second time or later, you start to get value that is more appropriate for the amount of mana you've spent. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Rising of the Day, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment. Creatures you control have haste. Legendary creatures you control get +1/+0. We've seen many cards like this over the years, and they just don't do enough to be worth a card in Limited. Haste is nice and all, as is buffing your legendary creatures, but I don't really want to spend 3 mana on an enchantment that gives me both of those things. Legendaries, again, they're prevalent in the set, and the buff will matter sometimes, but it won't matter enough. And haste isn't even something that always matters. There's lots of times where you don't want to attack with a creature you just played anyway. And so you see how limited both of these buffs can be. They're not always going to come up, and I think that makes this a D. Next up, it's Roherium Lancer, which for 1 red is a 1/1 human knight at common. It's got Menace, and when it dies, the ring tempts you. A 1-mana 1/1 with Menace, if you play that on turn 1, it can usually get in for a couple of damage before your opponent is even capable of blocking it, and that's nice. It does lose its relevance the longer the game goes on, of course, because it's, 2 creatures can easily block it and neither of them die from Roherium Lancer at a certain point. It does tempt you with the ring when it dies. That means it's like reasonable sacrifice fodder at that stage of the game and stuff like that, but it's nothing exciting. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Rush the Room, which for 1 red mana is a common instant. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn. If it's a goblin or orc, it also gains haste until end of turn. +1/+0 and first strike can help a creature win some combats, but not so many that I'm super excited about it as a trick. The extra goblin orc upside is good, and occasionally giving something haste will make a difference, but most of the time you'd rather use this as a trick so that your opponent blocks in such a way that you can kill their creature, rather than just buff your creature and let your opponent know it's coming before. So I think this is a C-. Next up, it's Smite the Deathless, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. It deals 3 damage to target creature. That creature loses indestructible until end of turn, and if it would die this turn, exile it instead. So as usual, red has a really good common removal spell. 2 mana for 3 damage at instant speed is already premium, and the fact this can exile things and shut down indestructibility is just gravy. This is a B. Next up, it's Spiteful Banditry, which for X and 2 red is a mythic rare enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, it deals X damage to each creature. Whenever 1 or more creatures your opponents control die, you create a treasure token. This ability triggers only once each turn. So you have to pump a lot of mana into this for this to function as a sweeper, but I think that's doable. Plus, sometimes you'll only want to kill a bunch of small stuff with it. Keep in mind, you only get a single treasure back no matter how many opposing creatures you kill, but that treasure may still assist you in casting something in the aftermath. It's also nice that it sticks around and gives you more treasure, though obviously that's not where the bulk of this card's value lies. Like most sweepers, it is highly situational, but the fact you can customize it to a degree and it scales all game long means that this will have an advantageous effect on the board state often enough that I think it looks pretty good, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Swarming of Moria, which for 2 generic and a red is a common sorcery. Create a treasure token, amass Oryx 2. A 3 mana 2/2 that gives you a treasure is decent, as is a 3 mana spell that puts 2 counters on something and gives you a treasure. It's always nice to have this fixing and ramp in red. I think this is a C. Next up, it's There and Back Again, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says up to 1 target creature can't block for as long as you control There and Back Again. The ring tempts you. Chapter 2 says search your library for a mountain, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. And Chapter 3 says create Smog, a legendary 6/6 red dragon creature token with flying, haste, and when this creature dies, create 14 treasure tokens. This looks pretty good. It's very similar to a Kamigawa Neon Dynasty saga because it gives you some nice effects before it eventually gives you a creature with the last chapter. Chapter 1 does a good job of allowing you to pressure your opponent if you need to. That effect, if you're behind, isn't great, but at least the ring tempts you and that will give you some value. Chapter 2 provides you with some ramp, which, again, if you're behind, that's not going to feel great. But Chapter 3 gives you an incredible enough creature that I think it makes up for the fact that Chapter 1 and 2 aren't amazing when you're behind. This is a little slow, but the value it generates is amazing. You won't always have something to do with all the treasure, if Smog does die, but it doesn't really matter. I'm giving this an A. And our last card is Warbeast of Goreroth, which for 4 generic and a red is a 5/4 beast, and whenever it or another creature you control with power 4 or greater dies, you amass Oryx 2. So On its own, this is a 5 mana 5/4 that amasses 2 when it dies. That's not bad, but not really anything to write home about either. Obviously, it gets better the more 4 power or more creatures you have, because, attacking with those, knowing that even if your opponent trades with it, you're going to get some value is nice. But it's still expensive and has mediocre stats to start. I'm giving it a C. So, those are all the red cards in Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth. Tomorrow, I'll be back with a look at all the green ones. If you want to make sure you're caught up on the set review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of the review, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.